Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Happy New Year, and welcome to the IGE Forum with the sponsorship of the Youngwon Corporation this time around. Today, I'm so very excited to kick off our distinguished lecture series in year 2022 with an outstanding guest speaker, Dr. Anne Krueger, the world's leading expert on international trade and global economy. She will be joining us live from Washington, D.C., and actually, to be more specific, from her residence in Potomac, Maryland, where I used to live in Washington when I was with the World Bank before, long time, to discuss the extremely critical and timely issues of the world economic outlook for this year. Although she doesn't really need introduction, please allow me to have a few words about her exceptional potential. Dr. Krueger has a truly remarkable professional credentials ranging broadly from academia and to international organizations. She served as the first deputy managing director at IMF, and actually she served as acting managing director of IMF as well, and chief economist and vice president of the World Bank. Very unusual to lead both sister organizations in Washington. Dr. Krueger is currently senior research professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, often called SAIS. The Harold and Caroline Rich Emeritus Professor at Stanford. She is a distinguished fellow and past president of the American Economic Association and the recipient of numerous economic prizes and awards. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Anne Krueger, who will speak for about 20-25 minutes first, followed by Q&A until around 10 a.m. In Seoul time as scheduled. Hi, Anne, welcome to Korea. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that very nice introduction. I'm, of course, honored to speak to you and to be here about the world economic prospects in 2021. Although it would be much nicer for me if we had no pandemic and I could be in Korea for this. I'm sorry I have to be so far away. It would also be good not to have the pandemic for other reasons too. The most obvious and the most important is that people are sick and dying, and many normal activities have been affected and are being affected. In addition, however, it would be good because the way the pandemic evolves has impacted and will very much affect the behavior of the international economy in 2022 and of course later on. It will affect not only the path it takes, but it will affect it because of the uncertainty about it and how it will proceed. If we knew how it would go forward, it would still be bad, but it wouldn't be quite as bad. In fact, the outlook for 2022 is affected by greater uncertainty than any prior year I can remember. Anyone thinking about the future knows that there could be unexpected surprises that no one thought of. The oil price increase of 1973 is a good example. It was not on anyone's list ahead of time. So before starting on the major uncertainties of this coming year, let me just remind you that there is always a risk that something totally unanticipated may happen. I'll return to the discussion of the pandemic in a moment, but first let me just point out some of the other major sources of uncertainty, which I will then discuss in turn along with the pandemic. Uncertainty about the pandemic itself certainly increases uncertainty in general by a very large amount. But in addition, there are 4 other reasons for concern this year, and let me list them just to give you an overview, and then return to a consideration of the pandemic and the other ones each in turn. The second one after the pandemic is geopolitical uncertainty. It is always with us, but as 2022 has started, there are at least 5 major areas of the world where tensions are running high, and in many of them running higher even than usual. They include very much the Ukrainian situation with the Russians amassing troops and material on the border, and you certainly heard about that over the past couple of days when there were meetings between the US and Russia. The US China confrontation is another large concern, especially over the South China Sea. The Middle East is always fraught with difficulty and presents two separate uncertainties. Issues with Iran's nuclear capabilities are as well as other tensions, such as with Yemen, any of which would heighten or at any time. Finally, and everyone in this audience is probably more aware of it than I am, there is a situation on the Korean Peninsula. I won't spend time on those uncertainties, not because they're unimportant, but because there are many experts on those subjects, and the ways in which they would affect the economic outlook would depend very much not only on which tensions exploded, but the ways in which they were then addressed by the international community, and each of them would require more than 20 minutes in and of itself, even to begin to discuss the situation. So let me turn to the economic side, where there are also greater uncertainties than usual, quite aside from the pandemic, although some of them are, of course, related to it. A major uncertainty is the macroeconomic situation and the policy responses to it. Here I have in mind, especially, an important question as to how strong inflationary pressures will be and how they will be addressed in the major economies. Uncertainty is greater than usual because we have no experience with consumer and investor behavior in response to and after a pandemic. To be sure, the Spanish flu and earlier pandemics took place, but the situation was very, very different in many ways. Information flows were much slower, vaccine and scientific responses were very different and less developed, and even political structures were different. Because it is new and different in this pandemic, there is also additional uncertainty as to how the authorities will respond with fiscal and monetary and other policies under different scenarios. A second source of uncertainty on the economic side is the prospects for economic growth in individual countries and in the world. Aside from the short-run questions regarding the degree of inflationary pressure and response, there are longer-term issues relating to ways in which the international economy will recover. Part of that pertains to the degree to which economic nationalism will lead to the shrinkage of supply chains and domestic regulation. That question is important in its own right, but the degree to which economic nationalism prevails will also affect the longer-term prospects for global economic growth. Another uncertainty is how the China-US trade war and other issues between those two countries will evolve. Should the trade war be relaxed, or better yet, ended, China and the US could, and I think should, find some win-win arrangements which would be good for the entire globe. On the other hand, there is a strong risk that they will each take measures negatively affecting economic growth in both countries, and that too will have worldwide implications, but of course not such happy ones. The China-US issue is of course related to questions about the future direction of global arrangements, especially for the international trading system. It was hoped that the Biden administration would reverse course quickly with respect to the US role in the WTO, the TPP, and other trade organizations and issues. To date, however, there has been less improvement than might have been hoped. That too clouds the outlook. Another uncertainty results from the financial situation of many developing countries. Looking around the world, there is ample reason for concern that one or more of them may be plunged into a crisis situation. Finally, there are the questions about future energy supplies, pricing, and policies. 2022 will be an important year for many of these questions, and uncertainty is certainly affecting the behavior of energy market participants. This is an astonishingly long length of uncertainties, and each will have major implications for how the 2022 evolves. Let me talk to each of the issues I raised, except for geopolitical concerns, as I said earlier. The most discussed uncertainty, and of course the most visible one, is the pandemic, which is understandable. It has affected everyone's life, including retail and mail order shopping, working at home or in the office, socializing, and many more. The medical miracle of vaccine development seemed to be becoming effective just when the Delta variant emerged on the scene. That now seems to be being replaced by the Omicron variant, which has spread at a speed that has astonished even the virologists and other experts. It has spread so quickly and so rapidly that the experts do not have enough data yet to be confident of their judgments. The available evidence, however, is beginning to provide hope that the Omicron variant generally results in milder illness than earlier viruses, especially for those fully vaccinated, and fully means the 2 initial shots and in most cases, 1 booster. A report 2 days ago suggested that Omicron cases would quickly surge rapidly in the United States, reaching a peak in 3 to 4 weeks, and then shrink equally dramatically. Some US experts are even forecasting that by March, it will be sufficiently subdued that life in the US might resume returning to normal. And that does seem to be still the expectation and a hopeful sign for the US. It has already happened in South Africa, seems to be happening in the UK, and maybe starting to happen in some parts of the United States where the coronavirus began increasing rapidly earlier on. We should also remember that the world is much better prepared for Omicron and any other new variant of the virus than it was a year or more ago. We have vaccines, and scientists are learning how to adapt them to new variants should they emerge. There are also better medical treatments for those seriously affected, and Omicron is in any event clearly milder. There is a risk that in the short run, hospitals may be overwhelmed, even though it is less serious on average than Delta, simply because a smaller fraction of a much larger number of cases could lead to a lack of hospital beds and staff to treat those needing hospital treatments. That seems to be happening right now in my state of Maryland, where the number of cases is already diminishing, but the hospitals are in a state of emergency because of the buildup of cases 2 to 3 weeks ago. Even on the optimistic scenario, that being the one where the Omicron virus dies out in a few weeks, there would still be a big question as to whether another variant might emerge, and that itself is a significant uncertainty. But even if it does not, and Omicron exits as quickly as it came, there are other questions that raise uncertainty. Before addressing those, I should, however, just notice that the world as a whole will be better off the more quickly Omicron abates and the less severe are the infections of Omicron victims of the virus. One of the most important lessons about the recovery has already arisen in the US. It is well known that inflation has accelerated much more and much more quickly than anticipated. When inflation started to accelerate, spokesmen for the Federal Reserve and for the White House all reacted by stating that the inflation was, quote, transitory, unquote, meaning that the inflation areas would quickly abate and some prices would even come back down. That clearly has not happened, and prices in the US are now about 8% above what they were a year ago, and they have continued rising at least until now, and we have the highest rate of inflation we have had in 30 years. The other advanced countries are not far behind. The Federal Reserve has already altered its stance, announced that the inflation is proceeding further than expected, and that it will withdraw quantitative easing and start raising interest rates later this year. That raises several questions. A first key issue is why prices have risen so much more rapidly than anticipated, and there are several factors that have clearly contributed. The key question, of course, is how important each of these is. The answers all affect the macroeconomic outlook in most of the advanced countries, which is why we have to look at that one carefully. The rapid inflation in the US and in most advanced countries is clearly a result of increasing rapidly for demand, and meanwhile, a supply not increasing as rapidly because of supply constraints, including both the shipping and the supply chain issues that you know so very well, but also including the fact that in many activities, workers simply are not turning up to work, and factories are unable to produce as much as they would like for lack of workers. Either demand increases or supply reductions could have led to rising prices, but the rate of increase really suggests that both of them are involved. Let me turn first to demand. Consumers reduced their spending during the first year of COVID because they stopped buying some goods and services, such as airplane trips, restaurant meals, hotel stays, and vacations. And because the fiscal stimulus, and especially the increase in unemployment benefits, meant that many workers were receiving higher incomes than before. In the United States, it is estimated that consumers spent about 18 percentage saved about 18 percentage points of their income last year, compared to about 8% in normal years. However, at the same time as the demand for certain goods and services fell, demand for some others rose, but not as much. To give an unanticipated example, an astonishing shortage has been one of dogs for adoption, which emerged as many stay-at-homes decided they would like a pet. Once that happened, the demand for services of veterinary medicine for animals, dog trainers, things like dog food, and other things associated with animals shot up. Likewise, it appears that there are many people decided that they either needed larger quarters and moved from the central city to the suburbs, or they decided to remodel to make their homes more comfortable and to make them more suitable to having people work at home. Both sets of decisions contributed to a sharp upturn in demand for renovation and remodeling of services and furniture. I am still waiting for a delivery of a window for my dining room that was ordered last April and was promised early in July. And it seems to have arrived in Washington this week and may be installed next week, because now their problem is to find workers to install it. On the supply side, shortages appeared in some of the items for which demand had risen sharply, such as dog food and construction materials, and of course, medical supplies. In addition, however, reduction in output in some key goods occurred either because of a shortage of inputs or because enough workers had become ill that production was affected, or both. Both of the effects were important. To be sure, some workers could simply shift to working at home, although even that entailed an increased demand for office furniture and equipment. But in the short run, unemployment rose sharply. On net, demand shifted from services to goods. In the US, the result was an increase in the percentage of expenditures that consumers spent on goods from 60 to 65% of their income, and the amount they spent on services fell from 35 to 30% of income. That's a huge shift. That shift increased demand for shipping transport, especially from China to the US. However, both because of constraints on the capacity of shipping lines to carry the freight, and because of some port disruptions, especially in China, and some other supply disruptions in production because of COVID itself, again, especially in China, the supplies of consumer goods did not rise as rapidly as demand. The consequence was shortages and hence rising prices in the US. Since many of the goods in rising supply were inputs to final products, semiconductors has of course been the one most mentioned and seems to be extreme. Shortages have spread across the economy. An interesting example was the market for passenger cars in the US. Shortages of imported parts and components led to a reduced production of finished cars. The result was an upward shift in demand for used cars, whose prices rose more rapidly than any other component of the American price index. Used cars are very scarce right now because people who cannot get new ones are looking for used ones. At first, in general, American wholesalers and retailers mostly maintained their prices and simply delayed filling orders. But as shortages have persisted, price increases have accelerated. As the recovery in the US has continued, another factor has contributed to inflation that was totally unpredictable. That is, even as factories and other workplaces reopened, many workers chose not to return to work. Indeed, the unemployment rate is now down to 3.9% in December. There were 11 million vacancies and only 6.3 million unemployed. That is, there were two job-seeking workers for every worker seeking a job. That was despite the fact that employment had not yet reattained its pre-pandemic level of 152 million in February 2020, and was 149 million in December. 2.5 million fewer workers certainly translates into 2 percentage points less output at that time, at least. Economists have begun referring to this phenomenon of the disappearing workers as the Great Resignation, meaning that people have who left their jobs early in 2020 do not yet appear to be even trying to get back to work. The labor force participation rate in the United States has fallen by almost the same amount as the level of employment. The significant uncertainty as to whether many of those who are chosen to stay out of the workforce will remain to stay out, or whether, as their accumulated savings during the pandemic run out, they will return to work. And we simply don't know, and there seems to be no really satisfactory basis to form a judgment. My own guess is that some of them will return to work, but some will not, but that of course doesn't tell you what fraction, and even that's important. Of course, there are related questions such as how many of those who worked at home will decide not to return to office work. There are many businesses wanting to hire and unable to find qualified employees, and that's certainly true. The question for assessing the outlook is how severe the labor shortage is and how long it will continue. Already, nominal wages have risen on average around 5%, and that rate appears to be accelerating. That in turn will reduce the rate at which supply can increase, raise businesses' costs, and hence further fuel inflation. The question of the severity of the inflationary pressure and its likely duration, especially in the US, is of course central to the 2022 outlook. There is no question but that the recovery is underway and that the US has been one of its leaders. It seems to have accelerated somewhat since November, but output and employment are still rising, and Omicron would appear to have been a significant factor in the fact that the rate of increase has not been quite as rapid. Assuming that the expectations for a quick peak in Omicron are correct, it is likely that the American economy will continue to grow. The question, of course, is how fast and how much of the expansion results in a higher rate of inflation rather than increased output. Should workers return to work in greater numbers, the shipping bottlenecks be broken, and consumers reduce the rate at which they want to spend as their savings are drawn down, the outlook would be excellent for a year of high real growth in the US, which would of course benefit the entire world, and other advanced economies would likely not be far behind because they are subject to much the same forces. But if instead demand accelerates more rapidly than the supply bottlenecks are broken, the result could be inflation rather than further output increases. The Federal Reserve's decisions as to policies will therefore play a key role. If the Fed fails to tighten as inflation is accelerating, it could lead to further, more rapid increases in inflation, and hence the need for putting on the brakes too hard at a later date, and that in turn could lead, as it has sometimes in the past, to recession. If, on the other hand, the inflation is truly mostly transitory, the Fed could err in tightening too much and hence offset part or all of the expansionary pressures that were taking place. Let us hope the Fed could find the right balance. It will not be an easy job. On balance, my judgment would be that the most likely scenario is that the Fed will tighten policy more than it has announced, but nonetheless likely tighten policy too little to bring inflation down anywhere near the Fed's desired 2% rate. For the rest of the advanced countries, the issue seems to be much the same as the US, although the extent of the stimulus early in the pandemic was less than the US, and the result will probably therefore be that inflationary pressures are somewhat smaller. For the world as a whole, the behavior of the American economy is, of course, crucial. Another issue, of course, is what happens in US-China relations on the economic front as well as on the political front. To date, the Biden administration, has not removed the Trump tariffs associated with the trade war, and the Chinese have indicated that they do not intend to remove their tariffs until the US does. Trade is an area in which there could be win-win relations between the US and China, and it is certainly to be hoped that negotiations can permit the relaxation of trade tensions and the removal of some of the trade barriers that were erected. That could benefit the entire world. For the world economic outlook, of course, the evolution of US-China tensions is important for several reasons. First and foremost, there are questions about the sustainability of Chinese economic growth, and a sluggish Chinese economy would, in itself, negatively affect world economic growth and trade. Issues with Evergrande other big companies, foreign ownership of subsidiaries in China, listing on the New York Stock Exchange by Chinese firms, and a host of other financial issues are undoubtedly presenting challenges for the Chinese government. If trade relations in the US were to improve, prospects for Chinese and American economic growth would be enhanced. And of course, if they deteriorate, that will reduce prospects in both countries, but probably more for China. At present, unfortunately, it seems more likely that China is in for a more difficult year, both because of the standoff within with the US and because of internal and especially financial issues. While the American authorities' chief economic concern and the determinant of the US economic's health is probably correctly the balance between inflation and expansionary policies, the Chinese appear to have their major challenges in the domestic financial and corporate governance systems. If all else goes reasonably quietly in the rest of the world, the course of the pandemic and the American economy will play a very large part in determining the world trading environment and economic growth in 2022. In that case, the outlook is for moderate growth in world trade as the recovery from the pandemic-induced recession proceeds. It would be highly desirable, of course, if the members of the World Trade Organization could address some of the major issues that are hindering the function of the WTO. Unfortunately, that does not appear to be the outcome, at least in 2022. The WTO needs updating for many issues, such as e-commerce and cybersecurity, and it needs revival, improvement for some of its functions, most especially dispute settlement, which worked reasonably well until the US paralyzed the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism by vetoing the appointment of any judges. For the long run, economic growth of the world economy, a vital, well-functioning multilateral system, and agreed upon rules of law for the trading system is imperative. Judging by countries' efforts to form preferential trading arrangements, it seems clear that the need for a well-functioning WTO is apparent to them, but at the moment, there does not seem to be a way for them to organize and bring it into being. In its absence, groupings such as the CPP and RCEP are emerging. Even the US is in discussion with other regional arrangements, such as with the European Union and the United Kingdom. It is to be hoped that the vast majority of trading nations will recognize their mutual interest in strengthening the open multilateral trade system and find ways to reinvigorate and resolve some of the central problems. Hopefully, that process could start in 2022, although it does not appear likely. Two more issues deserve at least brief attention. The first is the financial situation of some developing countries. It is widely recognized that the poor countries have inadequate supplies of vaccines, medical supplies, and the healthcare systems to deal with the pandemic, and that the world as a whole cannot escape the pandemic unless some of the world still has it. It is likely that measures will need to be taken in 2022 and will be taken that address the medical issues, and the prospects for healthcare citizens in developing countries will improve. In economic terms, however, there are other potential problems. Some countries have weathered the pandemic reasonably well. They have had their fiscal policies under reasonable control and were growing satisfactorily. They were then able to resort to using reserves and additional foreign borrowing to finance the needed imports in response to COVID. However, other countries were already in financial and fiscal difficulties, and COVID only intensified them. Argentina, for example, adopted an IMF reform program prior to COVID, but failed to implement it satisfactorily and is in danger at the present time of another sovereign debt crisis. Discussions between the Argentina and the IMF are ongoing, and it is not clear what the outcome will be. Turkey was also in difficulty prior to COVID, to give you just another example, and the authorities, and especially the president, seem unwilling to reverse their beliefs, not that low interest rates will cure a high and rising inflation rate, over 30% this past month, and are likely to be confronted with even more serious difficulties unless serious changes are made. And the authorities seem to be very stubborn in their views, with which almost all economists would disagree. The way to cure inflation is higher, not lower interest rates. Many other countries, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, to name just two in Asia, are also in unsustainable situations. India's private companies have large foreign exchange denominated debt that could cause difficulties. As I was working on this paper last week, I wrote all of the above, and just yesterday it was announced that the Sri Lankan authorities have had to approach the Chinese earlier this week to request debt rescheduling and indeed to get financing even for needed food and other essential imports. We are likely to see other cases. It is possible that these and other countries will be able to work with the IMF and undertake economic policy reforms that will enable them to work their way through without a crisis. However, among the uncertainties of 2022 is concern about the financial and sovereign debt situation of some developing countries. The final uncertainty concerns the energy environment nexus. The world seems to have decided for that reason that the future is in renewable energy. But in the short run, it's still dependent on coal and oil. As global economic activity has picked up, once vaccines were available, the price of oil rose sharply, and it appeared that shortages might again become the problem. With the advent of the Omicron variant, that concern has diminished, at least for the time being. But jet fuel consumption and other uses of petrol diminished during the early part of the pandemic and still have not reattained their pre-pandemic levels. If they pick up as recovery continues, energy concerns could again become important, and it will be critical that economic policymakers in all countries handle them reasonably well to avoid them being another repression force against economic growth. Finally, in many countries, measures are being taken that will encourage the shift to renewables, but may also be costly enough to affect economic growth. The same is true of environmental concerns more generally. And one of the concerns I have, at least, is that some of the well-meaning and well-intentioned people who are looking for environmental issues are spending too much on some things that will not have the effects that they need, while other things that could do much more for the environment will not be done, and that the growth inhibiting factors that some of the environmental activists are advocating will indeed slow down economic growth and slow down the improvement of the environmental situation. The likelihood of an energy crisis in 2022 is far less likely than any of the other uncertainties I have mentioned, but it cannot be ruled out. If it happened, it would put a damper on growth, as would severe restrictions on economic activity, even in the well-intentioned purpose of indeed improving the environment. So overall, what is the outlook? You've probably figured out by now that I think the economic activity from the pandemic is recovering and is likely, although by no means certain, to continue. Assuming that Omicron peaks and disappears quickly, some have described this as an ice pick shape recovery up and down very quickly. The main question will be how severe inflationary pressures are and whether the measures to meet them are timely and well judged in magnitude. In that event, it is likely that world trade will grow fairly rapidly, barring renewed intensification of measures and countermeasures in the US China confrontation. We are not likely to witness a much needed revival and renewal of the WTO, but will likely see some trade opening measures in the form of regional and preferential trading arrangements. Rapid growth of the advanced countries will, of course, make it easier for the highly indebted countries to resolve their sovereign debt and other balance of payments issues. Nonetheless, countries that do not reform the economic policies that got them in trouble in the first place will probably do badly this year. It is unlikely, however, that those problems could cascade into a widespread crisis and more likely to be confined to individual situations. Overall, then, the risks are there and they are significant. However, on balance, it can be expected that 2022 will be a year of recovery for the world economy. Each country will have its own issues to deal with, but overall, the global economy will most likely be a positive factor for them as they address their own problems. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions of the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Anne, very much for your brilliant opening presentation. Now I would like to move on to a Q&A session. First of all, this morning, I would like to start with inviting a very special guest, Mr. Ki-hak Sung, is a founding chairman and CEO of Youngwon Group. Chairman Song is one of the most respected business leaders, not only in Korea, but internationally also, and also very widely known for his generous philanthropic efforts. He is on the board of directors at our institute, IGE, as well as serving as a member of the International Advisory Council at Brookings Institution in Washington. I'm also very pleased that Chairman Song's Youngwon Group is supporting our very first webinar event this year with Dr. Krueger today. Let's welcome Chairman Song for his perspective on today's topic. Chairman Song, welcome.
Good evening, good afternoon, and Dr. Ann Krueger. It's truly nice to meet you, even see you over video conference. And I should say that Dr. John has made a very generous introduction for me. But I was delighted to sponsor this seminar because this is a part of a tuition I should pay to Dr. John. Dr. John, I fondly remember your lecture on world financial crisis in, I think it was 2008 at the Chamber of Commerce in Seoul. That has really clarified me, for me, the situation then. I'm truly indebted to him about that lecture. Of course, friendship after all. Thank you. Actually, we should be seeing each other, in person. But till then, that we should stay safe and healthy. But I have a few questions here. I'm so delighted that Dr. Krueger, very nice meeting you today, and your very well organized opening speeches. This is like a dissertation, which I rarely see. It's very succinct and then very clear. And then I understand more about our problem by your lecture. So it's very enlightening, I must say. So I have 3 questions. Some of them are mine, but I'm also doing for somebody else's one. You mentioned that one of the significant developments last year was the shift in demand from services to goods. Could you further elaborate on this point so that we have better sense about how this trend will likely shape up for the rest of the year? Second one is, in addition, would you share your insights on US policy stance towards CPTPP and other regional trade arrangements in Asia Pacific? Sorry, I have a third question here. I believe the shortage of logistics workers, US logistics workers, especially at the port and etc., truckers, is one of the reasons for global disruptions in a supply chain. This must be addressed as quickly as possible, as massively as possible. This, as well, China has also become an important source of supply chain disruptions, contributing to demand supply imbalance. For instance, China has abruptly stopped the supply of urea solution to Korea. Korea was shattered, in need of such essential supply to show their muscles in this respect. So there will be more to come how can we really handle that? How do you see these situations to evolve this year and beyond? Sorry, these are multiple questions there.
Those are all very excellent questions. And obviously, they're all questions on which everybody cares a lot, and we don't really have the answer. There is a fair amount of evidence on the services to goods question. That's in some ways the one on which we know most. And as I said, the shift was huge. It wasn't a small one. The demand for goods rose a good 10%, and that for services fell 20% from a smaller base. So it really was a very big compositional shift. But I can tell you, when COVID started, I stopped going out to restaurants. I didn't go to concerts or movies or other things the way I would. I didn't even go to my golf course. And certainly I haven't been overseas since the thing started. I haven't flown anywhere. I have not flown overseas. I have flown twice to California. Those are my only airplane trips. And for me, that's staying home practically. And I'm not unusual. Even things like going to see an annual visit to the doctor and just getting an annual checkup, I did every 18 months, not every year. And other services. A few services picked up. For example, I mentioned dogs. And the change that's happened in veterinary services and all the pet arrangements is remarkable. I have two nieces and a nephew in one family, and the parents never liked dogs. No, there no dogs were ever going to be in that family. And once the pandemic started, there were 2 dogs and nothing flat. And they're not alone. Everybody's getting a dog. You can't find a dog because everybody has them. It's unbelievable the change. I always walked my dog and I'd see 1 or 2 other dog walkers. Now I see 2 dozen in the same area. And dogs have just become important because people are living at home and they've got time for a pet. They didn't have it before. Now the real question is what happens when we go back to more normal living? Will we go back to the restaurants? And what are people going to do with their dogs and all those sorts of things? And the answer is we don't know. The trouble, and part of the trouble in restaurants is that the restaurant workers aren't coming back. I did go back to one of my favorite restaurants last summer, and I happened to get there a little bit early, and I saw the maitre d' whom I knew from earlier days. So I said to him, how are things? He said, not too good. And I said, well, what's the matter? I'm looking around. The restaurant is practically full. Looks like you're doing well. He said, well, it looks full, but we have the tables 6 feet apart as we're supposed to, and we have only 1 shift. When you were last year, which was before the pandemic, we had 8 waiters, 3 busboys, and 4 in the kitchen. We now have 3 waiters, 1 busboy, 1 in the kitchen, and me. And he was there before as the maitre d' anyway. So basically, and he said, we're trying to find people, we can't find them. So most of the restaurants I knew and liked before the pandemic that are still open, but they're open on reduced shift, reduced number of people, and they can't find the workers. Now, what's going to happen? Restaurant prices may rise, in which case people may not go as much. The workers may come back. Their savings, the savings of American consumers last year were 18% of their income. Normally it's 8%. 10 percentage points of GDP, which is huge, went into savings, and it's quite clear people built up savings that they wanted to spend. So now that the pandemic, or when the pandemic looked like it was coming down, people were beginning to spend a lot more. Will they continue to spend that way, or will they go back to their old 8% habit? It all makes a difference, and we don't know the answer. My own thought is that, of course, the trend toward more services as a percentage of income was going up for years. It's nothing new. The rate at which it's going up will probably be somewhat accelerated, but will certainly partly go back to the old thing. So I would expect services will come back one way or another. How much services wages and service industries will have to go up is an interesting question, because it's quite clear that a lot of people are not even trying for jobs now because they do not want to go back to their old jobs at their old wages. So there is some uncertainty about that. I hope that gives you a little bit more idea of my answer. It's hard to say very much more because it's so uncertain, but we just don't know. But there are problems with it, with services and how they will expand, but there will also certainly be somewhat more demand, and there will be some way in which they pick up to some extent, I think. Would you like me to continue to the second question? Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. The U.S. policy toward preferential trading.
TPP.
Yeah, but both of the rest of it and so on in Asia. in my view, it was in the U.S. self-interest. The minute President Biden came to, well, first in the U.S. self-interest never to leave it in the first place. But having left it under President Trump, I thought that President Biden would indeed resume U.S. or try to get back U.S. membership in TPP as soon as he took office, and he did not. I have been disappointed in that. I do not think there has been any clear statement from the administration as to why not. I have looked for it to some extent. There are some discussion of various issues, but it doesn't seem to me to make sense. And so basically, I think at the moment, the administration does not seem interested in rejoining or otherwise getting back into a regional arrangement in the Pacific. I think it's making a mistake. I think that will have to change, but how soon it will change, I don't know. And certainly that does not seem to be at the forefront of what the administration is doing. They say they are negotiating with the Chinese and they want to keep some bargaining power, but I don't see why that has something to do with CTPPC or any of those things. So I don't quite understand why they are doing what they're doing, but I think it's clear that right now they are not as interested as they should be. I think that shows in other ways too, as for example, the tariffs on steel and aluminum that the Trump administration put on were clearly very ill-advised. And yet the Trump administration has been very slow to take them off and should have done it much more quickly. And if I had a great disappointment with the Trump administration, it is one of them is in the trade area, where I think they should have done much more quickly. And all I can tell you is that I keep hoping it will change, but so far people don't seem to recognize what they're losing by doing that. So at the moment, that seems to be not as important as I wish it were. The supply chain issue, that's a hard one too. It's clear that the supply chain has several causes, but there were two of the five. China has 5 of the largest ports in the world. 2 of them closed down for various reasons. That was huge. Just in terms of world supply and demand, it was huge. And in other ways too. The fact that goods demand rose so much in the US was another factor, because the US imports a lot of goods, especially consumer goods, and inputs for consumer goods, especially from Asia, but especially from China. Well, that of course put even more load on the Pacific shipping routes. And the last number I saw is that the cost of shipping a container of freight from somewhere in Shanghai, say, to the west coast of the United States, Long Beach or something like that, is 11 times what it was 2 years ago. And if that's at all correct, it tells you what the huge magnitude of the shortage was. Now, there are things I think that could be done, especially in the US, where our policy toward oceanic shipping and so on, and especially coastal shipping, doesn't make any sense. President Biden has tried to do a few things, like he says, have people work around the clock in the ports, which we do not do, and which Chinese and everybody else does. But there also seem to be some local regulations that would have to be broken before that can happen, I guess. So there just seem to be a number of issues in the whole shipping industry, including the US Jones Act, which is a terrible thing, which prevents any foreign ship from going from one US domestic port to the next. And that's probably tying up some good ocean going ships because they can't get the freight that they would, and therefore going back half empty and so on and so forth. So there are a whole mess of issues there. And I don't think anybody's paid as much attention to them as they should. I think much of the supply chain issue, where people said, oh, we've got to be less dependent on suppliers from abroad, I think that's probably overblown. From what I read, most companies that rely on imports, or retailers who rely on imports from goods overseas, are putting pressure on the government to permit that to continue. They are not saying, okay, we will bring things closer to home very much. For the most part, until there's strong pressure, they seem to be recognizing that we need the trade, we need the benefits of trade, and we cannot do that. So I think there are questions about supply chains because of especially these the shortages right now. But I'm pretty optimistic that that will not have a negative impact to anything like the extent you might think if you read some of the rhetoric.
Okay. Thank you very much for your response to Chairman Song's question. Hope Chairman Song is satisfied with Anne's response. Any follow-up if you like?
Thank you. That I will will, through Dr. John, maybe send you a few more questions so that I can be more taught about these subjects.
Okay, we'll certainly
you.
follow up. Okay,
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, appreciate
Thank you
it.
for the questions.
Okay, perhaps Chubin Song may catch Dr. Krueger in Washington as he often travels to that part of the world. Now I would like to move to Dr. Hung-Jo Kim, who is the currently president of Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. As one of the leading government think tanks in Korea, especially on international economic and trade policy issues. Dr. Kim, floor is yours. You have about 5 to 10 minutes. As I understand it, Dr. Krueger is kindly
Thank you very much.
accept additional questions even after scheduled time. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Chairman Song Gwang-woo. And also thank you very much for Mr. Sangya for sponsoring this seminar. Also, they're raising a very excellent question, but I think that they're quite difficult question to answer. Okay, and then Professor Krueger, thank you very much for your address, very informative and also very insightful speeches.
Thank you.
And I am Kim Hung-jo. I'm a president of Korea Institute for International Policy. And my institutions cover the global economic issues, including international macro and finance, financial market, economic growth, and trade, and investment, and also the regional studies as well. And Professor Krueger's keynote today point out very important issues with respect to recent global economic environment. That is also a very crucial parameter for the Korean economy in coming years. I also found it very interesting that the outlook delivered by Professor Krueger is consistent actually with the view of my institution, KIEP. We are in the era of the elevated uncertainty in the recovery phase from the pandemic and other related issues. And policymakers should take this uncertainty into account. I'd like to address my observations on the great COVID-19 economic recession first, and then I would like to raise some questions if possible. First of all, I'd like to emphasize the noble nature of this pandemic-led recession. That is, this recession leads to recovery without hysteresis. In the absence of any serious imbalance in supply and demand before the pandemic, this COVID-19 caused an exceptional situation where personal contact was prohibited and cross-border travel was limited, as the Professor Krueger already mentioned in her very private story. The world was, suddenly thrown into a situation where people were faced to shun each other, almost as if like the zombie outbreak has occurred. Okay, so it would be very natural to think that normalcy can be rapidly restored once the pandemic is over. Bearing in mind that the expansionary fiscal measures are aimed at maintaining supply capacity, maybe I would like to raise talk about the two implications. The first, our fiscal pumping was not enough to maintain the supply capacity. And I'm observing some kind of turbulence problems in the supply side. And also the demand was rebounding without hesitation that we have already observed. The negative impact of the variants of COVID-19 has been gradually diminishing as time goes by. And first, because we are now better prepared to the pandemic shock, minimizing the negative impacts on economies, such as escaping total lockdown in the third year of the COVID-19 century, which I call. And also, our economic structure has been changed over the 2 years into that of the more resilience against the shock, new and huge investment on digital facilities. So very carefully, but adding more confidence, I would argue that the impact of the COVID-19 on the process of recovery would be minimized this year and next year as well, regardless of another variants hitting the world and taking a lot of the people's lives. the economy and and the situations in COVID-19 could be separated a little bit more. And Professor Krueger, I'd like to move to the question session, the following some issues. First, on monetary policy stance by the central bank in advanced economies, including the United States. The uncertainty has risen tremendously with the COVID-19 pandemic. While it works as a supply shock, there is not much of an option from the viewpoint of monetary policy. The recent inflation is also, however, driven by the demand shock as well, where tightening monetary may work as expected. If should the supply shock disappear sooner or later, the traditional framework, such as the inflation targeting, would still be a viable option. But what if it is not the case? How should the central bank respond if the pandemic should progress further for the next couple of years? And the second question is about the US-China tension. The US-China strategic competition has been expanded from the tariff measure to other areas, including technology, supply chain, and even value now. Therefore, it is hard to believe that the lifting trade barriers could immediately bring the US-China relationship back into more agreeable terms and lead to an amicable phase. In order to reset and normalize the relationship, further efforts from the both sides seem inevitable. Would you share your insights and how to care the kind of the efforts should be and could be made to improve the US-China relationship this year? And my last question is about the multilateral approach by the US. As you mentioned, I mean, now the WTO is almost on stop. And so, and also the 12th ministerial conference was canceled, postponed. So, and the WTO is now also losing its momentum and ground relevance for a very long time. And so the dispute settlement system as well. So all of these kind of things that shows that quite not so favorable conditions for the multilateral trading system. And so I'd like to talk about the Indo-Pacific economic framework raised by the Biden administration. What do you expect? What do you expect the Indo-Pacific economic framework as shaping? And so your expectations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, for your mostly lecture and quickly three questions.
Sorry about that.
And I would appreciate your rather succinct response to Dr. Kim, because we have a series of questions received from chatting room. Our viewers are sending questions to us as well. So I would rather save Anne's time as much as we could. Okay, is that okay, Dr. Kim?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
And you want me now, okay, to go ahead?
Yes, please,
Okay.
please respond to him.
I'll try and do so quickly. And first off, thank you, Dr. Kim. They're interesting comments and interesting questions. And I appreciate them and would love to give them more time. As to monetary policy stance, even if COVID continues, I do not think that that's going to change things fundamentally. It may affect what the real interest rate ought to be, or things like that. But in terms of the underlying inflation targeting framework, it may change the way the inflation targeting framework should be met. I think there are already questions about the time frame in which the inflationary, the interest rate is supposed to be the target is set. There are already criticisms in the US that it's too ambiguous because it's over such a long period. All of these things are happening. But on the other hand, I think that would have happened anyway at some point. And I think maybe COVID speeded up that happening, but I think we are more and more learning how to live with COVID. The phrase that's sometimes used, which may not be quite right, is it will become more like the flu, as something we don't like, we take precautions against, but we go on with our normal lives. And there's at least some truth to that. And I think maybe enough that monetary policy will go that way. Certainly long-term QE and things like that cannot go on as they are now, I think. And I would still think I'm still in the school that the real interest rate will not forever stay at 0 or below, which makes a difference too. But other people disagree with that, and that's an opinion and not something that there's good, long, nice theorem that proves it or anything like that. Nothing at all. Okay, I'm hurrying quickly. The second question was, what about US China? What would I see happening? Well, I guess my hope had been that we could do something not dissimilar with what we had done with the Russians during the Cold War, which was, it was pretty much recognized that there were some areas of mutual interest in which there were mutual gains. And there was some interest which each side said, that's mine and you stay out. And there was some where there was room for negotiation in the middle. And it seems to me that with China, we have to live in the same world, and there's some issues in which we ought to talk about mutual gains, in which trade is one. And not only trade, but lots more. Even I think intellectual property rights is something which the public interest internationally has something to say. And once you do that, is there. I'm going very quickly. I'd like to elaborate, but won't. The third issue, of course, is the environment. We are all in the same planet. And China has as much interest as anybody in getting rid of some of that pollution. And there are bound to be things like other things like that that I'm not even talking about. Some of them we already do. We obviously cooperate on airline schedules and things like that, and who may land in which country and all the rest of it. And I think there's got to be the same kind of approach as has happened there. Unfortunately, one of the things President Trump did that was so very bad was he poisoned American opinion about China. At the time President Trump went into office, opinion polls said about 70% of Americans said that they thought Chinese growth was good for the US. And now it's down to about 30. And that's sad. And I hope that somehow or other the Chinese or other people in Korea and Japan and others can help the American people. And those few of us who still think that perhaps the animosity was overdone, get back to a more sensible framework in which we can sort of say, yes, the Chinese are there, they're there to stay. We have to live in the same world. How do we do that? This does not mean that China can go and steal everything, nor does it mean that the US can always get its own way. Let's see how we can contain this thing and get along reasonably. I would hope we can do that, but at the moment, I am not as optimistic as I would like to be that that can happen. Thirdly, the multilateral WTO Indo-Pacific. I hope the US will go back to the WTO and start pushing the open multilateral trading system. I hope that we don't just go to the regional trading blocks or things like that. I think that we will all lose if we do that in big ways. On the other hand, at the moment, I don't see that that's happening, and so I'm more pessimistic than I would like to be on that score. I do think that there's so much scope for gain within the Indo-Pacific region that the arrangements that have already been made will help a great deal there to give more growth there, and I hope the United States will wake up to that as soon as possible.
Okay, is that okay, Dr. Kim? Okay, thank you, Anne. Perhaps last couple of questions of my own, coupled with some questions we are receiving from our audience, press people included. So essentially 2 points. And one has to do with your very interesting point, a very important and perhaps a sensitive issue raised toward the end of your presentation. That has to do with, as you put it, energy environment nexus or dynamics that we face now. This, the process of pandemic crisis, clearly international attention has been raised in a huge way for sustainable investment in green finance. That's pretty much well said and right direction towards dealing with this carbon neutral world and the coping with the climate crisis, climate change issues. And this is often, the issue is often summed up by ESG management has become a buzzword in recent years. Now, one of the key disputable issues has been about the treatment of nuclear energy. Now, just released EU taxonomy also covers this issue. There's a big gap between the position taken by a country like France and Germany on how to treat this nuclear power in achieving the net zero target down the road. I hope I have some view that you may like to share with us, but how best we should approach this issue of apparent conflict, if you like, between achieving net zero targets and preserving growth potential, if you like. So this is not an easy question, but certainly there is a huge interest about it. I would like to have a quick comment from you on this one. Second has to do with a sort of implication of recent and prospective development in global economy for Korea's policy. Now, Dr. Kim just mentioned a short while ago, if I'm not mistaken, Korea has become more, I'm quoting, resilient over the last few years in the process of dealing with this pandemic crisis. But there may be different views about how the current administration has managed economic affairs recently, because the fact of the matter is that fiscal deficit has gone up quite a bit, and household debt, the pace of increase in household debt has been one of the top, meaning worst, amongst OECD countries. So in a way, Korean economic structure has become more vulnerable, in many views, to external shocks. So there are legitimate arguments for governments to be very careful about expending any sort of fiscal expenditures or monetary easing in this particular period, especially with this rising inflation. And given that we have plenty of liquidity out there in the market, so we have to be concerned about potential bubble in the various asset categories. So what would you advise to the authorities at this time, based on your experience with tackling economic financial crisis in the past, and you have gained a lot of experience with other economies as well. And I see this, I say this because this is a very timely issue here in Korea, with presidential election coming up in less than 2 months. So understandably, candidates promoting all kinds of money spending programs. Now I think that some care, prudence has to be there to avoid any sort of negative, disastrous outcome of populistic approach. So my question became a bit too long, but I hope you have a comment on these 2 points as a wrap up.
No, on the first one, it seems to me that the really crucial issue is finding as many ways as possible that are both sustainable and growth enhancing. And there are such ways. In fact, looking around the world, there are things like subsidies for water that make absolutely no sense. And government budgets could be improved, and at the same time, efficiency of resource allocation could increase if some of those things went away. And it seems to me politicians are all too happy to spend money on new programs. They are not happy to look back and re-examine the ways in which expenditures could be better used or better allocated, or where you could even cut expenditures and get more bang for the one or the buck. in other regards. That's certainly true in the US. It drives me crazy sometimes because everybody wants a new program. The idea that there are things that we're doing that we could do much more effectively at lower cost and so on do not seem very often to get attention unless there's a crisis of some kind or other or something really dramatic happens. It's very hard. And yet on the other hand, there are so many of those ways when one starts looking around where the subsidies are, where the inefficiencies are, where you can make a difference, that it just bothers me greatly. And I sometimes get very irritated with all of this. Should we increase expenditures or should we increase taxes, cut expenditures? What should we do? When in fact, there's just this whole scope for greater efficiency in government as well as in the private sector that many of us, certainly including the United States, has not done enough about yet. As to nuclear power itself, it seems to me that if we agree on a target like 0 emissions by 1950 or whatever we agree on, and some countries choose to do it with nuclear and some without, that's perfectly okay. I think clearly there are different viewpoints, and quite clearly if people around Chernobyl are scared stiff of nuclear power, I understand it. If they don't want it and they can find other ways to cut, that's fine. So in a sense, I'm not of the school that we have to do it all or not. My own view is that whatever else it is, it's clean. And in that sense, probably ought to be on the list of things that's acceptable, but that we don't need to say that necessarily has to be the one on the menu that's chosen. There are too many other things you can do that would indeed cut the carbon emissions. And if somebody else wants to do that, that's fine. So, but nuclear shouldn't be ruled out, I don't think, because it does seem to have a lot of promise in some ways. So let me quickly move to Korea because I know you're in a hurry. And obviously Korea has had very good over the years economic performance, and I've got a lot of faith that that's going to continue. I do think that we are all in a situation where we have to be careful about increasing expenditures without balancing it, because most of us already have increased expenditures because of COVID. There's going to be some point at which we need to get more back to balance. It would be better to do it gently and gradually rather than waiting until we hit a crisis and some things have to be cut abruptly. Now, different countries are in different circumstances. Some countries, I've looked at a few where indeed I think their problem is that they have tax rates that are too low and they should be generating more tax revenue. Other countries have far too high rates of some kind of taxes and not others. Some have very high civil servants payrolls relative to private sector. There are all kinds of different things in different countries, and I do not, regrettably, I have not had enough time to look at Korea, nor have I had the opportunity to have any sense where those things are in your economy. One thing I do remember, and this is a question, is there was a time when you had too many people going into jobs that were temporary, which then discouraged apprenticeships, which discouraged learning, which discouraged greater productivity and what have you in the part of the labor market. I don't know whether that's still there, but in most countries, there are things like that where you can find things on the supply side that can make a big difference. I think in Germany, early in the 2000s, the German reforms at that point were a perfect case where they found ways to increase growth prospects and all that by looking at getting rid of some of those inefficiencies. And I would be astonished if Korea has done so very well that you're the only country in the world that doesn't have any of them. What they are, I don't know. And on the expenditure versus tax balance, I just don't know the numbers well enough to say which way that one goes.
Okay, thank you very much. But before you go, I just received another question from audience. This is a tough one. I'm warning you, because how do you see the direction of the dollar's strength down the road? Predicting, or exchange rate is such a tough job for any economist. Any quick comment?
Well, as you know as well as I do, and as your questioner knows equally well, there's a difference between the nominal exchange rate and the real exchange rate. And the real that's important because at the moment, at least, it looks like U.S. productivity is not rising. Inflation is rising. So I would expect some depreciation of the dollar, especially as we now have a fiscal deficit of large proportions and a current account deficit. So certainly all the pressures will go that way. So unless there are some strong policy actions to offset some of that pressure, I would be in the school that the U.S. dollar just has to depreciate, not only in nominal, but in real terms, relative to the major currencies, and that would be the euro, the pound, and the yen for sure, and the won, and maybe a couple of others. But the dollar has to depreciate relative to them in real terms as well, unless we get our act together somewhat better. Our inflation rate is
Thank
now
you.
up. Our
Hope
inflation
that-
rate is our inflation rate is up to 8%. I think
Okay.
that's higher than most of the other advanced countries already. The fiscal deficit last year was 13% of GDP. And it's not going down with the things that are passed. We are all out for expansion at the moment. That may have some benefits on the real growth side, but it may have some costs on the inflation side, and it may also have costs in terms of slowing down. And I'm pretty sure there's some costs in terms of productivity loss. So
Okay.
all things considered, I think I could give you a pretty easier answer than you thought on that one. Those forces all suggest that the dollar will depreciate in real terms.
All right. Okay, all right, thank you very much. I'm sure that will be helpful for our audience who
It
raised that
it
question.
may also be wrong. we are in an uncertain world, but on the other hand, that's
Right.
my view.
Okay, all right, thank you very much, Anne. It's been great session we had. We thoroughly enjoyed your very insightful speech and informative contents you shared with us as well. I look forward to seeing you very soon again. Next time, definitely in person rather than virtually meeting. Until then, like Chairman Song, I would like to wish you well and stay safe and healthy. I look forward to keeping in close touch. Well,
Thank you.
take
My
care.
wishes
Thank you
for
very
you.
much.
My wishes for you are the same. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.